Hello, my name is Hynes. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with Marcus A. Clarke around the brand new film that is being broadcast or sort of available recently on Netflix, Blood Brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. It is an incredible film and an incredible story. And if you think you understand this history, you think you understand the story of these two figures, you probably are mistaken. There's a lot here that I didn't know, that I think a lot of people don't know if you did not approach it from this very useful and innovative angle. And I'm indebted to the filmmaker for bringing it to us, indebted to Netflix for bringing it to you all, and also for making this conversation possible. So thank you to them. And I'd love to just get going because Marcus is already here. I don't have to bring him on stage. Marcus, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for making time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this film and let people know what they're in store for.
Yeah. So some of you will have had a chance to watch, because by now, when you're seeing this, it has been made available on Netflix. And if you have not, we'll hopefully make it pretty clear that you should make time for it in the coming days. I'd love to know just sort of like the kind of basic how you came to the project, Marcus, in terms of just in terms of what your previous work has sort of led to in terms of working on this one, and then we'll also talk a little bit about how the film is constructed and the production aspect of it. But if you don't mind telling us how you came on board.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Aaron Sampson, my agent actually connected me with Aaron Sampson, who's one of the execs for Kenya Barris. And during that meeting, she told me that they had bought the rights. Kenya and Lightbox, production company in LA, run by Jonathan and Simon Chin, that they had purchased the rights to this book, Blood Brothers, written by Randy Roberts and Johnny Smith. And, initially my ears kind of like perked up. I got really excited. And to be honest with you, I didn't know how deep the friendship was between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. I knew about both of their, biographies and like their history and what they've kind of done over the years and what their legacies are. That's kind of part of my upbringing, part of how I was raised. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I only moved to LA about 3 years ago. So I really didn't know that they were such good friends. So the first kind of initial steps for this project was a lot of discovery, to be honest with you, and research into how much of the relationship we'd be able to actually put on the screen, how much was documented, how much exists in the archival material. And in that preliminary research, I found these two individual clips of Malcolm X referring to Muhammad Ali as his brother, and Muhammad Ali, speaking of Cassius Clay at the time, Muhammad Ali as his brother. And so that was the first kind of like aha moment where I was like, wow, these guys, this is a real relationship. This was a real friendship. Something really happened here. And so, again, a lot of the initial research was discovery. But when I came back to Kenya with kind of how I would approach telling this story, what were the key moments that I thought were kind of the most important integral moments where their paths collided or overlapped, I explained to him essentially how I would tell the story, my POV on the story. And after that pitch, he pretty much hired me really soon right after that. And it was kind of off to the races. But between when they had the rights to the book to when we actually started was probably about a year process. So they were looking for a director for about a year. And then I came in and I got the project, and it was, something I'm extremely grateful for. And it was, it's a big responsibility. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot of legacy here. And it was really important to me to make sure we got the story right. And so that was kind of the first steps.
I'd love to, if you don't mind sharing, I'm always interested in this part of the process. If you don't mind telling us a little bit of what your pitch was and how that sort of went over.
Yeah, I mean, the film in its final form now is definitely different from the initial pitch. And that's something that kind of always happens with documentaries. And how I approach a documentary, I always like to have kind of an initial kind of concept and POV for how I'm going to tell the story. And then, of course, in a documentary world, the story is kind of like a living, breathing thing, So you really want to keep yourself open enough to be able to follow the story wherever that might go, even if you have an idea for what you think is going to happen.
Yeah.
You really have to let the information and the truth kind of guide you in that mission. But initially, my pitch was, I was familiar with Muhammad Ali's quote that his greatest regret was turning his back on Malcolm X. That's a quote from Soul of a Butterfly, book that he wrote with his daughter, Hannah Ali. And so I was already familiar with that moment. And I looked at some of the most memorable moments in which Ali was a hero. And that led me to 1996, the Olympic torch kind of ceremony. And, my idea was, let's look at this quote of regret and let's kind of, let's go back in time and let's go from 1996, where we all remember Ali as a hero, being celebrated as a hero, American hero. This is like a really amazing moment in American history. But let's go back and look at how we got there, and look at how the legacy of Muhammad Ali has kind of changed. And I don't want to say it's been distorted, but it's definitely been changed and altered and tweaked kind of over the years. And so let's go back that way through the eyes of like the hero, so to speak, to how he got there. And so that was kind of the initial kind of way that I was kind of packaging it. And then my intention was to try to tell, even though this is a 55 plus year old story, was how do you tell a 55-year-old story and make it feel intimate? So my next kind of goal was, how do I structure this film into a 3-act structure, and how do I make it feel intimate? And so, the first conversations kind of with the producers was, how do we get in touch with the next of kin? How do we get in touch with the daughters of both men, and really present a film that's balanced between the legacies of both men? And of course, there's a lot of critique and criticism in there, but the goal is to have a kind of a balanced exploration into this friendship. And that's kind of how we started kind of going down that path.
I want to get into so many of the things you just brought up, and I will the next bit of time, but I'd love to sort of then stay from that beginning spot for the moment and talk about the source book by Randy Roberts and Johnny Smith, and like what that offered you as a starting point and what it didn't offer you, because it's a text, it's a different thing than a documentary film. So just in terms of like what that gave you, and then where you had to take it from there.
Yeah, so the book's incredible. I really liked the book. I did feel like there were some cultural nuances, cultural sensitivities, a little bit of an authenticity that I think the book doesn't necessarily take into account. But what the book did do was lay out a wealth of research. Johnny Smith and Randy Roberts are professors, they're historians. And so they really looked at all of the available information on both men. All the publications, all the documentaries, and more importantly, all of the FBI surveillance documents. And they basically took all this information and cross-referenced where these men were at any particular point in their lives, focusing particularly on this 3-year time period, which is what the film really tackles. Their story is really between 1962 and 1965. Mm-hmm. And so it's actually it's a short 3-year window of a relationship that's extremely potent, that really kind of changes the trajectory of history and the trajectory of both of their lives. And so the research was a really strong foundation for where to look for archival material, what documents we would need to support kind of where these guys were at different times, and really lay out the arc of the relationship. And so I use that as kind of like the foundation, again, for how to find the archival material and kind of where to look, what rocks to look under. And then I tried to surround that with as much kind of cultural context and authenticity, and again, grounding the audience in the time period of the 1960s. Because I think it's really important to understand who these two men were. To understand the relationship, you have to understand who these two men were. And in order to understand that, you need to understand where they came from whence they came, and the time period and what they were seeing, and what kind of externalities, what was the temperature of America at that time? Segregation and Jim Crow is rampant. There's impression of African Americans as discrimination, at really high levels. And so these things, I feel, had a direct impact on the men that they became, and really gives a little bit of a window, gives insight into why they even connected, like why this relationship worked. So I think the book was really kind of instrumental in that regard. And then for me as a filmmaker adapting a book, we all hear, like, you go see a movie that's based on a book, and people always say, oh, it's not as good as the book. You should have read the book. It's not as good as the book. And I really did not want that to be the case with this film. I wanted it to, in ways, mirror the book, but take it further than that and go deeper, kind of, again, into the cultural nuances that are behind this, because I feel like those are such important pieces of the puzzle in terms of understanding this. And so that was kind of like, my goal, my intention in approaching this film.
So just if you haven't seen it, the authors do sort of show up as sort of narrators in some ways, and certainly in terms of sort of narrating how certain things went down, how certain moments went down in this relationship. But obviously, as you mentioned already, like what you then go beyond is then sort of bringing these other figures who were witnesses, who were present, and then also using archival to kind of like, flesh out a little bit more. I'd love to hear about finding some of these other figures who appear in the film, and who you wanted, and also sort of what you thought you might get from it. Then also like what came through those interviews that you hadn't anticipated.
Yeah. There's a wealth of information that came from those interviews. Again, like the initial kind of who's going to be speaking in this film, who's going to be the contributors. A lot of that was influenced by the book originally, which is like, well, where did they get their sources from, right? So we find Herb Boyd, who was an editor, co-editor on the Diary of Malcolm X. We have Peter Goldman, who wrote the Death and the Lives of Malcolm X. We have Robert Lipsyte, sports journalist, and Jerry Eisenberg, legendary sports journalist. And so, we kind of mined all the sources and found which of these individuals are still around and can talk to us, who really spent their life's work researching these men. So, really credible sources who are really familiar in that time period. And again, because it's such a small window of time, everybody has kind of nuggets of information and pieces of information. So it was really kind of our job to bring all those pieces together into one kind of cohesive narrative, and kind of weave those pieces of the story together to really show people what this relationship was like and what it was really about. And so a lot of really good stuff came from that. But then that's just kind of the historical and kind of scholarly look at it. We also needed the emotional tenor, the sentiment. And so getting to the next of kin, getting to Miriam Ali, Hana Ali, Ilyasa Shabazz, daughter of Malcolm X, and of course the daughters of Muhammad Ali, was really important because they've been in many ways carrying the legacy of their fathers. They're extremely well versed in their fathers, in their work, in what they've done, and what their mindsets were, on their philosophy, their ideas of kind of religion and faith. And so that was a really key component because this relationship is based around faith. A lot of people ask me, what is the thing that Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, what brought them together? What did they do together? And while there isn't really an easy answer, their relationship was based on faith. It was based on the philosophy of the Nation of Islam that was being provided for them. And, Malcolm X was such a mentor to Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali at the time. And a lot of their conversations were about this. And so that was really important. But probably the most important to really connecting the whole story was getting the interview with Rahman Ali, Muhammad Ali's brother, his only brother. And so, it's a really precious interview. It's probably our most precious interview in the film. And again, because the story is so old, it's really hard to find people who had firsthand knowledge, firsthand accounts of this relationship, people who were there. And as you watch the film, if you notice, Rahman Ali is always there. He's there at every step of the way through his brother's journey from a child, all the way through the scope of his life. And so, when you're watching the film, you see Rahman right next to them. You see him in between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali at certain times. And so, as soon as I got that interview, I really knew exactly how I was going to tell the story, kind of hinging on this double, triple entendre of blood brothers, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali being blood brothers, but the story is kind of being told to you from the blood brother. And so it's this kind of beautiful weaving that kind of naturally happened, and we're very lucky to have that interview. And so, Rahman Ali, I think you can glean a lot about the relationship from him. He's a very complicated character, and he's had several strokes, so it's a little bit difficult to follow him. But what that means is he's extremely careful with his words. He's extremely particular with his words. And if you listen, the words he uses to describe Malcolm X and to describe this relationship is really compelling. But the complicated part is when you get to the betrayal and you get to some of these difficult issues, he also expresses, a great deal of frustration and anger, to be honest. And I think that, Rahman is one of the closest things that we have currently to Muhammad Ali. And so I think a lot of information can be gleaned from his contributions in this film. And I think that's going to be an eye opener for a lot of people.
It is, and it was for me. Like you described how he's there every step of the way, and he's like in some ways like of course he's an incredible source, and of course he's an incredible voice, but to actually see this evidence of him being present every step of the way, and no one ever writes about it that way, no one ever covers it, the idea like he's always there, and there's always more prominent figures in the room to be writing about in terms of this coming together, but he's so often right there. And that's just an incredible resource to have, and also just to have that heart, that kind of like that the sort of these he's not just a figure who's present, he's just intimately involved in these conversations.
Yes. And I think, to the point about the relationship being complicated, he really displays that. And it shows you, and part of what my intention with this is to not cast the blame on anybody, but really to just present how complex this situation was, that Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, found himself in, and how complicated it was for Malcolm on the other side. It's not just cut and dry. There's a lot of external forces that influence these decisions and this, quote unquote, this betrayal that some people would see. There's a lot at stake there, and there were a lot of stakes when it happened. And so I think Rahman, at the end, you get this sense that obviously he loves his brother, and he has a lot of admiration for the relationship that his brother had with Malcolm X and for what they went through. But he still holds on to this kind of frustration and this anger out of the actions of Malcolm X and what some might say is a betrayal or a mistake or a misstep. And so I think it really helps to have him in the film. And as you mentioned, he's been, for a good portion, kind of left out of history and left out of kind of the documentation of this relationship and other kind of instances in Ali's life. So it was really powerful, and we feel like the right decision to really include him and elevate his voice in the way that we have.
There's a way in which sometimes the longer it takes to tell a story like this, the more potential there is for new ways of looking at it, and I feel like often the people who are close to the movers and shakers of the world actually have so much to offer and are so crucial to actually how things happened and how things went down and how things were processed. And it's very hard to prioritize them when a Muhammad Ali or a Malcolm X are available to us. So the fact that they're not, that we actually then, you're actually able to say, oh no, actually this is a point of view that has so much to show us. And it almost means that in 2021, you actually can focus on him finally.
Yeah, 100%. I think that, I've done a lot of work in the documentary space, but with celebrities and with athletes and artists. And, one thing that I can say is, like, everybody who achieves extreme amounts of success or extreme amounts of notoriety and hits these kind of cultural high moments, they all have a foundation. They all have a team. They all have people that they rely on who are not in the limelight. And for Muhammad Ali, that's very clearly his brother Rahman. It was his sparring partner. Mm-hmm. They went through their career together. What a lot of people don't know, unfortunately, isn't in the film. Rahman, the night that Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay fights Sonny Liston to win his heavyweight championship, Rahman fought that same night at the same fight. He was like the undercard. He won his fight, and Ali actually came and was rooting him on from the side of the ring. So,
like an hour before his own fight.
An hour before his own fight, arguably the most important fight of his career at the time. He's rooting on his brother. So, like, this is not just a friend. This is his pillar. You know what I mean? This is somebody he really relied on. And so I think it's kind of, in telling this story, it's really important to have we're really fortunate. I'm really grateful to have his voice in it, but it really gives, another credible source, another credible witness who was really there. And so, in the film, you really hang on his words because you just don't know what he's going to say next. And he was right there. So it's really important to the film. I think it's a huge piece of the storytelling.
There's a way in which I do a lot of writing about documentaries. I know documentary filmmakers really well. I have a lot of conversations. It's like my favorite conversation to have is with documentary filmmakers about how they sort of have to sort of fashion a through line or a narrative and create a form out of reality and sort of honor that. Often it comes up words like complexity and complications. It's sort of like kind of like the language that we use to contend with all this. But I have to say how much I appreciate how truly, sincerely complex this story is and how complex you allow it to be, because there's a way in which it's hard not to instrumentalize history and to instrumentalize stories for whatever end we want to serve, to tell a story, to sort of to make a movie. And I love how, and it feels doubly important here because you're looking at men who were constantly instrumentalized and often at times even instrumentalized each other to get to an end. And you allow that to play out. And, I just think that's so important, in particular, you see, anyway, so I was thinking about this throughout the film, just how every step of the way, somebody's kind of playing off another person to achieve something, and how that can be dehumanizing. Maybe it's for a good end, maybe it's for a much bigger, important cultural change, but you're still
Hmm.
instrumentalizing a human, and you allow that to kind of, that navigation, those negotiations to be, to be evident to us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's part of the challenge, especially with this story, and that's kind of how we got to just the kind of style and the arrangement of the film, which is, like I said before, like not everybody in this film has the whole story. Every contributor has a piece of the story to offer, and so we really try to set up the film where people are almost handing off each part of each story beat, each story point to the next person, to the next person, to the next person who can speak to those specific moments. But it's definitely a challenge. And, with any documentary like this, about two hugely iconic figures that there's so much history about, I think people expect the story to cover both of their lives in their totality. And really, with this film, just to remind people, is really laser focused on this 3-year time period for the most part. We
Mhm.
give some backstory leading up to it. And then there's, of course, the third act of what happens kind of after Malcolm X's assassination, and how the relationship, at least on Muhammad Ali's side, kind of transitions into a much deeper meaning with Malcolm X's family, with his daughters. And that's something I don't want to spoil it, but
Yeah.
I want to remind people the film doesn't end when Malcolm X is assassinated. There's more information, in fact, new information in the third act about kind of where those issues of regret and that anger that Ali had, when that changes and kind of transitions into regret, and the actions that he takes as a man after that to support Malcolm X's family and his daughters. And so I think that's a piece of new information that's going to be extremely compelling to people. Yeah.
I think that, and you also, you honor this history, you honor those years without having it be entirely lit up by our contemporary expectations and needs to sort of, bring this into the current moment. But now that we're talking about it, I think it's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard. It was hard not to watch and see, another moment here between, a moment of possibility that then gets sort of torn apart, about a misalliance or fracturing that happens in a social movement. It happens over and over and over again in history, and it's being done to Black leaders all the time. I mean, obviously, in this
That's
case,
correct.
the FBI has played a huge role in that. And there's sort of just warring factions that were sort of developing in terms of personality as well, which of course is a lot harder to avoid. But I'm just curious where it brought you to in terms of thinking about ways forward, in terms of alliances, in terms of social movement, in terms of like what might be possible. How do we avoid such things in the future? That's a big question, but it's hard not to watch the film and think about like how to avoid such a thing in the future.
Yeah. All of what you just said is kind of is very much like an underlying theme beneath the surface of this film.
Right.
It's about this relationship, and it's about kind of the love and the joy and the philosophy and the faith and the fallout. But underneath is this kind of subtext of, between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, between them individually, there was no, that I could find, there was no moment or thing between them that actually causes their relationship to begin falling out. It's really all of these external forces and these externalities that are kind of, preying, if you will, on the relationship and trying to divide them. And that's between the relationship with the Nation of Islam, of course, and that's also between what the FBI is doing with their surveillance and really infiltration. People think of surveillance as kind of being this passive thing. This was not passive. This was an active action to infiltrate these groups and to sow seeds of division. And so I think what we have to kind of remember is every civil rights leader, everyone who has taken a moment to speak truth to power in this way, like Malcolm X did, or even like Muhammad Ali was, there are going to be these external forces that try to dampen that action, that try to work against that action. And I think we've seen that today. We've seen that all through history with these movements. And I think that's something that we have to remember as a community. And also, that when we're having these kind of smaller beefs, if you will, and issues between us, that we have to remember to zoom out. I think that's really important, to zoom out and to realize, what are you trying to achieve and what's going on here? Are we on the same side? Are we on the same page? And take into context kind of the greater good here, because when you watch the film, I think it's hard to not ask yourself, well, what would have happened if Malcolm X wasn't assassinated? What would have happened if this relationship had just continued to blossom and to bud? And I think your imagination can run wild with what the possibilities are. When you look today, or the last couple of years, the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, you wonder, how would those movements be different? Would we need those movements if Malcolm X hadn't been assassinated? I think that's the big question, because a lot of what he was doing was creating like a response team, a response to these injustices of police brutality and the slaying of unarmed African Americans and discrimination. He was really addressing those things for Black people and for Black and brown people around the world, and really trying to hold someone responsible. This is 55 years ago. Again, he died in 1965, and the issues that were at the top of his agenda are the issues that are still dividing us, and we're still dealing with in the present day. So I think there's definitely a message there to be remembered, because you start to think, well, what else could he have achieved? Muhammad Ali lived to 74 years old. Malcolm X died at 39. That's really young. Ali had a whole nother kind of lifespan, so to speak, if you think about it in that context. Right. And so it begs all of these different questions. But I think you're spot on. There's definitely a message underneath about not just unity, but again, realizing that there's a greater good, especially when you're trying to achieve these kind of monumental, when you're trying to attack these monumental kind of problems that are presented against Black and brown people.
There's a moment, and I'm sorry, at the moment I should have written his name down, but one of my favorite interview subjects in the film talks about the metaphor of delivering a package across the street.
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry if you don't remind his name.
Melchizedek Supreme Shabazz Allah.
Who talks about basically, I have a mission to deliver something across the street. It's a distraction to talk about what I'm doing as I'm making my way. But if I actually deliver the package, that's the most important thing. Right. Really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, so what I'll say about he's an incredibly fascinating character. He's really authentic. He's about as authentic as it gets as far as the Nation of Islam from the 1960s. Just to give some context, the nation as it is today is not exactly the same formation as it was in the 1960s. But in that time, Melchizedek is a devout follower of Elijah Muhammad, even to this day. Right. And so, he was almost he was a student kind of in the crowd when Malcolm X would do his teachings at Temple Number 7. And so part of his contribution is not just the authenticity, but it's really the sentiment, right? I really feel like for people of today, it's really important to understand the sentiment in which Malcolm X gets assassinated. Why were these people so mad? Why were they so angry about this? I wanted people to understand from that perspective, what were the kind of feelings and emotions that these devout people had towards him and towards what they might see as the betrayal. And so in that moment, what he's explaining is kind of like this philosophy, so to speak, of having a mission, within the nation, and that your mission to do something is the only thing that people should be focusing on. And what he's trying to do, or what he's doing, is kind of trying to alleviate, he's trying to kind of, I guess, distance Malcolm's movements at that time from the teachings, and say, well, this was a deviation. This broke the rules, so to speak, in the discipline. And so he goes from that statement to explaining that Elijah Muhammad lifted Malcolm up, when he was at his lowest point, and made him, essentially anointed him as the speaker for Black people. And so in that moment, he's trying to explain the betrayal from the side of people who are followers of Elijah Muhammad and the nation at that time. And so it's kind of like, for a lot of African Americans, it's kind of like insider baseball, like kind of talk you'd hear your uncle say at the barbecue. And you don't usually get that in a documentary like this, which is why I thought it was so important. So many things that could be said, I feel like, are either diluted or shielded based on the legacies of these men. And here we have somebody who was really there, who really has or had a stake in the race in terms of like what the outcome might be, expressing this kind of this really kind of ugly sentiment, but it's authentic.
Sure.
And I think that's what's most important to take away from it.
Sure. And authentic, and also like it stuck with me too, because the implications of it can be ugly, but I also do think that it's hard not to look at these all very flawed men at this time who definitely made some mistakes and had complicated personal lives, but there was a sort of an ambition there, a drive, which was to make a huge difference in terms of Black America, and make a huge difference in terms of the lives of people in this country from that point forward. So it's hard not to sort of grab onto the idea of like, yes, there's a greater good here that maybe should be the thing that we can all look to, and it's inevitable that whether it's media or whether it's subterfuge, whatever, that we're held back, that people are held back too.
Yeah, and we're dealing with heroes. Like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali are heroes. That doesn't change. But I think in a documentary film like this, it's important that we're open and honest about our heroes' mistakes or transgressions or, possible missteps. And we can do that while still celebrating our heroes.
Yeah.
That doesn't change anything. It doesn't take anything away. In fact, in my opinion, it's additive. It really helps you understand where they came from. It helps remind us that we all make mistakes. And, in my opinion, people aren't always all one thing. You can be righteous and you can be disloyal. You can be, you can be both of these things at the same time. And I think that's important for people to remember. And when we see that, and when we understand that, I feel like that gives us, that's how we can find the next Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X, if we're really honest about these things. And I think it gives a lot of context to who these men were.
And one last thing, I'm just curious about how, you're laser focused on this period of time, and there's so much to be gained from that, and so grateful for that. I'm curious in the process if you started getting curious about going beyond that time in any direction in terms of making something going in the future, particular stories, particular narratives that develop beyond those 3 years.
Yes. So short answer is yes. I have a bunch of ideas for other things potentially in the future. I don't know if that will be realized, but I ran into a lot of information and a lot of threads that could lead to other things in this whole process. So the short answer is yes, but you should know that the original rough cut of this film was like about 3 hours long. It's a little over 3 hours, to be honest. And part of that was not that there was a lot left out in terms of this particular story of the friendship, but a lot of that was kind of, we were editing in lockdown. We did a year and a half of editing throughout through the whole lockdown, we were editing the film. So against the backdrop of the George Floyd protests, of the insurrection at the Capitol building, I'm making this film in isolation. We're all in isolation virtually, but we're making this film. And so I had a lot of ambitions to kind of try to cover everything, to try to address everything at once. And one of the things that Kenya really helped me do was to really focus down and whittle down to the relationship itself, and to not kind of muddy the water of what it is the core story is we're trying to tell, which was a really helpful kind of lesson for me. But there's definitely just so much information and things that I feel that either haven't been touched on, haven't been exposed yet, and a lot of work there that can still be brought to the screen outside of the relationship. So yeah, there's plenty of other areas to go as it relates to this. And again, the first cut was 3 hours long. So
for what it's worth, I want you to be able to do that. I also really want it to be a 3-hour cut too, not because I think, again, it should be other than what it is, but one of the great things I think that you allow for this to be as complicated as it is, an hour and 20 minutes, a speaker comes in that I hadn't seen before, and I'm like, oh, I want to know more of what he has to say, and because it kind of keeps going, and there's all these other avenues to go down. So I think it's perfect for what it is, but I definitely wish if you have the will and you have the opportunity for you to go down those different avenues.
Yeah, I'd love that. We'll see. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. And I also would love next time you're back east to your native Brooklyn, come on out to Queens to the museum. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, man. I'd love to come. That'd be amazing.
Good luck with the film. Good luck with the next couple weeks. And if you haven't again seen the film, please make sure you do. It's on Netflix. Thank you again, Marcus.
Absolutely. And thank you for the time. I really appreciate it.
Of course, anytime.
Cool.